Unusually for this channel, today's episode of Beautiful Books is actually looking at collectible paperbacks, specifically the murderous art of Tom Adams' Agatha Christie covers. I have a fairly decent collection of Agatha Christie novels, including original and facsimile first editions, the lovely Folio Society volumes I've discussed earlier, and as well as translations of the fun French comic book series. But there will always be a warm space in my heart for the stack of tatty second-hand paperbacks that were my first exposure to Christie's inimitable style of cosy crime. My first job as a 14-year-old was located directly opposite a used bookstore, and for the first year, every week when I got my pay packet, I would literally tear it open inside that store and buy myself one cheap Christie paperback and a Penguin Shakespeare play. My earliest start at collecting. Tom Adams was Agatha Christie's paperback cover designer for almost 20 years, and so many of the paintings used for his covers would be instantly recognisable to older Christie readers. He was also renowned for his work on John Fowles' books The Collector and the Magus, and an iconic series of Raymond Chandler novels, as well as for creating special effects for Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey and Mike Hodges' Flash Gordon. Tom designed nearly all of the UK and European paperback covers for Fontana from 1963, his first being A Murder is Announced, to 1979, finishing with Miss Marple's Final Cases, as well as a couple of later special editions commissioned specially by HarperCollins. Tom was also contracted by Pocket Books to design 26 covers for the US market, which were released between 1971 and 1974. These covers are quite different to the European cover art, being mostly done in a more naturalistic style on large wraparound canvases, which allows for more narrative movement across the image. Many of his UK or European designs also feature on the 1970s French Librairie des Champs-Élysées editions, as well as the Spanish 1980s Selección de Biblioteca Oro series, published by Editorio Molino. Consequently, his designs are recognisable worldwide. The juxtapositions and trompe-l'oeil techniques Adams employed in his paintings were an unusual approach in cover art when he first began designing his Christie covers in the late 1960s, recalling that this was long before the current age of cut and paste. The elements in each cover are usually symbolic and often cleverly chosen to represent clues from the stories without giving away the ending. His covers are also distinctive in that they rarely show violence, instead creating a quiet feeling of menace through placement of an incongruous mortar and pestle, a mysterious powder, or a carelessly discarded gun. For today's video, I'll be going through the American wraparound cover art first, and then onto his classic British Fontana paperbacks, as Tom designed some strikingly different artworks for these different markets. The American cover for A Murder is Announced features an early scene from the book where the lights go out at a dinner party and a door swings open, revealing a man with a blinding torch who demands the guests stick 'em up. The woman in pink has erroneously been identified as Miss Marple, but in fact she does not join the story until later on. Early on, he rejected the idea of showing Miss Marple or Poirot on his cover designs, rationalising that the characters were so firmly fixed in the reader's imagination that they could never be satisfactorily shown. For the US cover for And Then There Were None, the twisty texture from the rope and the seaweed helps to create a chilling atmosphere for this creepy island mystery. The central grave in this scene from By the Pricking of My Thumbs is from a small churchyard in Hampstead, while the tombstones are based on a real cemetery near Wimbledon Common. The red splashed rose in the foreground is a Commandant Beaurepaire, the Perry's York and Lancaster rose mentioned in the book. The woman's head in front of the multi-gabled house for this cover of Crooked House is based on Mary Dunning, Tom's wife at the time, while the girl reading actually comes from an Arthur Rackham painting called Marjorie and Margaret. More accurate than the UK cover, this US version for Dead Man's Folly features the body of girl guide Marlena Tucker, found dead in the boathouse. The cover image for Death Comes as the End is quite similar for the UK and the US designs, featuring a young girl's profile against an Egyptian mural surrounded by dishevelled mummy wrappings. For Easy to Kill, the rooster here is in the forefront, and it appears in both the English and the American covers. It's suggestive of the black magic mentioned in the book, and it's one of several red herrings that Tom occasionally intentionally includes in his cover designs. The cover for Endless Night features the house at Gypsy's Acre and a sinister woman who warns of an ancient curse, along with several elements from William Blake's poem Auguries of Innocence, from which the book takes its title, especially the bat that flits at close of eve and the owl that calls upon the night. The cover for Evil Under the Sun was actually quite a personal one for the artist. The driftwood you can see in the forefront of the image here was a gift to him from his second wife, Georgie Adams, and she also posed for the face you can see in the corner. The harbour vista in this cover for Funerals Are Fatal includes a Victorian painting of a nun, along with clues such as a painting of Polflexen Harbour and wax flowers under a glass shade. The cover for Hickory Dickory Death has a beautifully poetic mood, established by the gentle glow of the lights from the pub and the street lamps along the road for which the novel is named. Both the US and UK covers for Mrs. McGinty's Dead feature similar cameo settings of the charwoman's parlour, including the remains of McGinty's supper of kipper, bread and margarine as described in the book. The US title Murder in the Calais Coach was changed from the original Murder on the Orient Express to avoid confusion with the 1932 Graham Greene novel Stamboul Train, which had been published in the US as Orient Express. Tom extensively researched the actual interiors of the Orient Express during this period for his cover. The design for Nemesis is quite different to the others in this pocketbook series because the publisher wanted a primarily text-based cover, which you see here. The collapsing greenhouse and the camellias are based on the Camellia House at Chiswick House in London, similarly used in the UK cover. The corridor in the cover for Ordeal by Innocence was inspired by a strange BBC version of Alice in Wonderland by Jonathan Miller, where you can see people running through corridors filled with feathery curtains. For Passenger to Frankfurt, the statue is the Wagnerian hero Siegfried, and the background castle is based on the Bavarian Neuschwanstein Castle. The cover for Peril End House depicts the Cornish coastal setting of this novel, with the rocks and the sea looking much like the bed of Ruthven Steps in Newquay. The obscuring branches in the foreground of this stylised cover for Remembered Death are actually sprigs of a rosemary bush, Rosemary Barton being the name of the murder victim in the story. This moody cover for the ABC murders depicts the English south coast, featuring Betty Barnard, victim B, who was killed on the beach at Bexhill. The image for the cover for The Body in the Library presents the archetypal image of the very conventional Colonel Bantry sitting primly in his library, interrupted by flashy heels and the dead girl's feet intruding on the shaggy rug in the foreground. The clocks on this cover are of course all stopped at 4:13. As are the clocks surrounding the body found in Wilbraham Crescent in the opening scenes of this novel. Red herrings all. The Mirror Cracked has a much more literal interpretation for the US version than the UK edition, and it's actually one of the few that I've seen that has the cover artist credited on the back. Interestingly, The Mystery on the Blue Train is the only Christie cover in which Adams portrays one of the detectives. The dark figure on the back cover next to the blue train is intended to be Hercule Poirot. The front, of course, has a boardwalk in the French Riviera, along with a handful of rubies. The cover for The Pale Horse includes several black magic elements, including the pale horse of the title, which is taken from Revelation 6:8, where it's ridden by Death as one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. In Third Girl, we have the three young women who share a London flat. Many of the background images feature characters in masks, as disguise plays a prominent role in this story. In the cover for Towards Zero, the body is not immediately apparent. It's cleverly covered by the distorting effects of the rippling water, and you have to look closely to see it well. And now for the British covers. The two covers for A Caribbean Mystery are quite different. This first one shows the head of Major Palgrave, purple of face with a glass eye and the general appearance of a stuffed frog, while the second is more romantic, with the body of the girl and her wavy locks blending beautifully into the water under Palgrave's watchful eye. A Murder is Announced was Tom's first Christie cover, painted for Fontana in 1962. It introduced his still life style, with simple items made menacing, such as the wilting violets, the blood splatter on the news cutting, and his trompe-l'oeil style with the bullet holes in the wallpaper providing a three-dimensional sense to the image. The clock is set at 6:30, the time for which the murder was announced. The later cover makes use of the violets and timepiece again, but also introduces a menacing figure in the doorway. This cover focuses on the nursery rhyme Sing a Song of Sixpence, which contains the line A Pocketful of Rye, from which the title is taken. You can see the music from the rhyme in the background, showing the line, Down came a blackbird and picked off her nose, reflecting the maid who was found strangled with a clothes peg on her nose, along with the rotting skeleton of a blackbird. The yew-berries in the image are used to create taxine, the poison used to kill the king. The European cover for After the Funeral is quite similar to the US pocketbook cover for US title Funerals Are Fatal, including also Polflex and Harbour in the background and the portrait of a nun with a murder weapon under a glass shade. And Then There Were None was renamed several times for obvious reasons, with its title using lines from a then popular nursery rhyme. Tom's cover here makes use of a doll he borrowed from a local shop. The earlier cover for Appointment with Death depicts the monstrous, swollen female Buddha of Mrs. Boynton amid the red caves of Petra, along with a syringe containing the cause of her death. The sinister spider used in the later cover, climbing out of Ginevra Boynton's head, is a stylised trapdoor spider. The cover for At Bertram's Hotel features the facade of the hotel, which is believed to be based on Brown's of London, with elements from the story reflected in the woman's hand in the foreground holding a poisoned chocolate and a bullet. The macabre doll's head found in the chimney in the book By the Pricking of My Thumbs is described as having lost one of its eyes, and the sinister cracks in its china head add to the general feeling of menace. The original illustration that you see here had more elements, but it was a stipulation by the publishers that there be only one central element on the cover for the first time the novels appeared in paperback, so a simpler version was used instead. Later editions often flipped the image to face the other direction. The cover for Cards on the Table is an interesting representation of the bridge game that forms the setting for the murders in this book. The image includes elements Tom has extracted from a John Collier painting called The Cheat, which shows 4 people playing bridge at the moment they discover one of them is cheating. One of Tom's earlier covers, Cat Among the Pigeons, is a simple composition for this story about tennis-playing schoolgirls and smuggled jewels. The Crooked House is another Christie title based on a nursery rhyme. On this cover you can see a delicate vintage illustration of the rhyme in the background, behind the ballet slipper and the spilled pill bottle. For Dead Man's Folly, a beautifully romantic pre-Raphaelite sunset in the background of this lovely field of flowers is shockingly marred by the body of the girl guide that's found in the boathouse in the story. The girl is similar to the body in the American cover, but the rest of the scene is quite strikingly different. The mural in the background of Death Comes as the End reflects Christie's inspiration for this novel, which came from a couple of letters from the 11th dynasty of ancient Egypt. The body on the cover represents the embalmed Nofret, and the toy line that Horry repaired for Renesmeb is placed inside the dishevelled mummy wrappings. The UK cover of Death in the Clouds, known in the US as Death in the Air, makes use of an interesting perspective, with the wasp in the foreground and a period plane in the background. In this cover the plane is named Henquist, however this inaccuracy was corrected to Prometheus as per the story when the image was later reproduced on a Collins cover in 1980s. The Egyptian head in Death on the Nile was based on the mask of King Tut. It's obscured here by the pearl-handled revolver used in the shooting of Simon Doyle in the novel. These gorgeous surrealistic covers for Destination Unknown owe much to Dali, according to the artist. The first version is quite different to the still life covers that came before it, including as it does such bright psychedelic images along with the faked plane crash, leper and a broken necklace from the story. The later cover has these dark rocks transforming into sinister toads, along with the dark hooded leper in the foreground. The metamorphosis of the rock is a reference to the character of Mr. Aristides, who is described as a small yellow toad in the novel. Elephants Can Remember is another cover featuring many different elements from the plot. The first cover has a very 70s vibe, with multiple elements competing for attention. My preference is for the later cover, which features a charming composition through which the ghostly remembering elephant is wandering. For this illustration, Tom noted his inspiration for the dog came from Landseer's Terrier, and the background landscape from The Scapegoat by William Holman Hunt. To create the stunning cover for Endless Night, Tom rang up the RSPCA in London on the off chance they might have a dead bird available. And as luck would have it, they had just been given this tawny owl, a night bird that had died in mysterious circumstances. The UK cover for Evil Under the Sun features a creepy wax model juxtaposed with the dreamily painted sand. This is a reference to Linda's childish attempt at witchcraft against her stepmother. The cover for Five Little Pigs is a lovely composition including several elements from the story, including the nursery rhyme from which the title is drawn. The Fontana cover of the 450 from Paddington, which was published in the US as What Mrs. McGillicuddy Saw, contains various clues from the story, including a compact, a piece of fur, and a flower sprig that dropped from the body as it was dragged to the sarcophagus. The background image is based on a real Roman sarcophagus. Bobbing for apples is part of the fun at the Halloween party, the title of this story, and this fabulous collision between a juicy apple turning into a dripping skull, surrounded by swirling water, revealing a menacing pumpkin, an evil witch, and a beautiful girl. Christie's dedication for Hercule Poirot's Christmas, known in the US as Murder for Christmas, notes that she wrote it in response to her brother-in-law's request for a good violent murder with lots of blood, and the various covers Tom painted for this title reflect that sentiment, with blood dripping from holly leaves, simultaneously conveying both murder and holiday cheer. Hickory Dickory Dock is another early cover featuring the nursery rhyme text and music in the background with a scattering of gems made menacing with a sinister syringe and the blood splatter. The later cover keeps the same colouring, but the story elements included in this one are a disturbingly green frightened girl, a diamond ring that ties various elements of the story together, and an adorable mouse, which isn't in the novel but of course ran up the clock in the nursery rhyme from which the title is drawn. The UK cover for Lord Edgware Dies is an unusual Christie for Adams, as it includes a close-up image of the actual violent dagger attack rather than his usual one-step removed focus on the preparation or aftermath of murder. The disparate collection of different elements on the cover for Miss Marple's Final Cases reflects the collection of different mysteries in this short story collection, and it was in fact the last cover Tom painted for Fontana. This early cover for Mrs. McGinty's Dead is another that creates a sense of menace through a fairly simple composition. A photo, a pill bottle, a scarf, and a splash of blood, focusing here on the second murder that occurs in the novel rather than the first. The later cover for Mrs. McGinty's Dead is very similar to the US pocketbook cover for this story, with another cameo setting of the charwoman's parlour, including the remains of McGinty's supper of kipper, bread, and margarine, as described in the book. For this cover of Murder in Mesopotamia, one of Christie's most archaeological murder mysteries, Tom has painted here a Pleistocene death marks he created, along with other elements from the story, including a threatening letter, a fake goblet, and that very hairy rope. The cover for the collection of short stories in Murder in the Mews includes elements from two of the stories. A mirror, one of Christie's favourite devices, which is reflecting Anubis, the Egyptian god of death. This early cover for A Murder is Easy as a Still Life, featuring the mixture and a dead canary, augmented with the spider, which is presumably representative of poison. The later cover features similar elements to the US version, which is titled Easy to Kill, with a deliciously creepy forest background and the rooster and dagger in the foreground, but this one includes additional tormented faces, which I think make it really quite a lot more gruesome. Resisting the desire to include a cliched train on the cover of Murder on the Orient Express, here we see instead a map of Macedonia overlaid with other elements of the story, such as the pocket watch set at 1:15, burnt matches, charred paper, and a pipe cleaner. The orange line shows the route of the Orient Express through the towns of Vyhovci and Brod. This early cover has a detailed background of golden sand with the transmitter and the ring, but the eye is drawn to the bloody hammer in the foreground. It's hard to believe it's a painting, not a photograph. This later cover makes use of another nursery rhyme theme, with varying elements of the story cleverly included on the prominent jigsaw pieces. Similar to the American cover, this UK cover for Nemesis features the Camellia House at Chiswick House in London. Even the shape of the tree is quite distinctly recognisable. To Buckle My Shoe, published in the US as Patriotic Murders, was one of Tom's early covers, and it was the first to use a nursery rhyme illustration in the background, with this innocent image brutally torn through with that menacing gun barrel pointing directly at the reader's face. Ordeal by Innocence is one of the titles for which Tom painted many covers, 4 including the American version. The earliest is this broken cup and dagger still life, which references the two clues that unravel the second murder, coffee cup and the feathers of the dove from the poem. The next cover features that truly terrifying snake. And the last that he did was the fighting dove and raven. Each cover shows such a different interpretation for this title. It's quite interesting. Parker Pine Investigates is another beautiful trompe-l'oeil painting with a two-dimensional botanical drawing in the background, offset with the gorgeous three-dimensional cut glass decanter and medal of the Order of St. Stanislaus, 10th class with laurels, which ends up draped around the neck of the city clerk. The card-based cover for Partners in Crime is for a collection of short stories that feature the light-hearted sleuthing pair Tommy and Tuppence. The image is drawn from the story Finessing the King, the Gentleman Dressed in Newspaper, which is probably the strongest title in that collection. In the earliest cover for Passenger to Frankfurt, the female villain is represented by a black widow spider at the centre of her web. Similar to the US edition, it features the statue of Siegfried, and both covers make use of Neuschwanstein Castle in the background. The second cover features several characters' faces separated by a grinning skull on the same background. The pilot and his damaged plane on the UK cover of Peril at End House, along with one of the Buckley girls and the World War I gun that shot one of them, are here intended to hint at the lament for a long-lost hero lover that prompt the action that leads to the mystery of this novel. This book was actually written in the wake of Amy Johnson's solo flight to Australia in 1930. The rather gruesome cover of Poirot's early cases is a compendium image that includes elements from several of the short stories in the collection, including a bee sting, the head of a ventriloquist dummy, and a collection of jewels that are used on the bee's legs instead of pollen. The dramatic rocking horse in the foreground of the cover of Postern of Fate is Mathilde, described in the book as a rather splendid-looking horse even in decay. The decaying greenhouse in the background was based on the greenhouse from Tom's own garden. The photo used on the cover of Sad Cypress is based on one of Tom's father, taken during the First World War. A scratch from a rose is one of the clues in the case, and the will is suggestive of the location of the story, which unusually for Christie is a courtroom drama. Overall, the gentle nature of this image reflects the love story elements of the novel. Sleeping Murder was the last published Miss Marple, written many years before publication but intended to appear after the author's death. The needle and ball of wool framing the dead young girl are clearly symbolic of Miss Marple and part of a loving memorial in this special paperback release. The deceptively simple cover for Sparkling Cyanide, published in the US as Remembered Death, has a packet of cyanide and a glass of champagne in the foreground, with a beautifully textured evening bag behind, which was used to contain the poison. The cover of Taken at the Flood, known in the US as There Is a Tide, portrays a pivotal scene early in the book, a death during the London Blitz, along with other clues from the novel such as the tongs and a lipstick bullet. The cover for ABC Murders features an actual ABC, or alphabetical railway guide, a monthly railway timetable guide to the UK, originally published during the expansion of the British Railway Network. Victim B is shown within the frame on the beach at Bexhill. Christie's grandson, Matthew Pritchard, has claimed in an interview that the story was inspired by a copy of the ABC guide that Agatha kept beside her telephone at all times. The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding is a collection of shorter stories, with the cover simultaneously portraying a happy Christmas scene overlaid with several more sinister elements, including bloodstains, a scarlet ruby, and a robin redbreast. The earlier cover has a collection of Christmas ornaments, toys and tinsel juxtaposed with that blood-stained dagger. The chess piece in the cover for the Big Four is one of the bishops from the famous Lewis chess set, a group of distinctive 12th century chessmen carved from walrus ivory. The Chinese dragon in the background symbolises some of the many Chinese elements in the tale. Tom's cover for the European version of The Body in the Library is unusual in that it doesn't feature the library at all, focusing instead on the foot of the corpse, with white beads to represent the white spangled satin of the dress and a couple of flies to symbolise death and decay. The Clock features a simple cover for this Poirot mystery in which he's challenged to prove his claim that a crime can be solved by the exercise of the intellect alone. The body of the victim in the story is found surrounded by clocks. I love the simplicity of Tom's cover design for The Hollow, with the distortion of the water used to create a simple barrier between the viewer and the revolver beneath it. The title is the name of a house in the story, but it's also a reference to Tennyson's poem Maud, which Poirot quotes halfway through. "I hate the dreadful hollow behind the little wood." The Hound of Death was Tom's second Christie cover. He borrowed the skull from a friend and added in the crystal ball and the all-seeing eye as a nod to the otherworldly aspects of the tales in this collection. The cover for The Labours of Hercules plays with Christie's description of several characters as having long curved noses like birds. Over their shoulders they wore loose cloaks that flapped in the wind like wings of two big birds, with another decaying apple added to the creepy atmosphere of the scene. The Lister Hill Mystery is a short story collection published only in the UK, although the stories therein appeared in other collections in the States. This montage cover includes elements from several stories: a banana skin and revolver from The Golden Ball, Car from The Manhood of Edward Robinson, and a representation of royalty from Swan Song. The title The Mirror Cracked comes from one of my favourite Tennyson poems, The Lady of Shalott, and fittingly this Fontana cover is actually one of my absolute favourites. It features a delicate figure based on a painting of the Lady of Shalott by the Victorian painter John William Waterhouse, juxtaposed against that wide bloodshot eye looking through the crack. A stunning interpretation. Another seemingly innocent cover for The Moving Finger in fact features several dark elements of the novel. Poison pen letters made out of words cut from old documents, a victim found with a glass of potassium cyanide, and a pestle used in a violent attack. The torn document in the background of this piece is from a volume of Record Office facsimiles in Tom's collection, and Miss Marple uses a torn piece of paper to determine the culprit. For The Murder at the Vicarage, we have two very distinctively different covers. The first early still life was painted in 1962 and includes an authentic 1930s tube of paint from the artist's grandfather, as well as a contemporary Collins Crime Club novel in the bookshelf. The second cover was painted only a few years later in 1968, but it features a quite different Magritte-type image. The artist borrowed an early racket from the Dunlop archives to ensure he had the right silhouette for the time this first Miss Marple mystery was published in the 1930s. The dagger used in the image of the murder of Roger Ackroyd is a real Tunisian dagger, as described by Christie in the novel, which Tom stabbed through his own tweed coat to create the model for this image. Such sacrifice. The background on the mysterious Mr. Quinn is from a 17th century drawing showing Harlequin and Columbine, characters from the Commedia dell'arte, which inspired the main character for this collection of short stories, the Harlequin. Tom's intent with the cover was to convey the contrast between the hard, cold brutality of the dark gunmetal with the velvety softness of the death's head hawk moth. The revolver was borrowed from a friend and featured in several of his cover paintings. The earlier cover for The Mystery of the Blue Train includes the story's elements of disguise, strangulation, a jewel beyond price, and the colour blue. The second deep red cover provides different elements of the stories, including the same blue train that was used on the US cover, but all broken up and reflected through the facets of a ruby. The Pale Horse has a darkly chilling cover, the illustration bringing to mind black magic and the sinister goings-on in Much Deeping. Last time I visited London, I specifically stayed in the Seven Dials district so that I could read this book during the evenings there. Tom used his own glove and hand to model this image and included, of course, 7 clock dials in the background. Both of the covers for this murder mystery set in a tiny Dartmoor village feature a swirling combination of many characters and elements from the story The Siddiford Mystery, known in the US as Murder at Hazelmoor, giving you a lot of information but not giving anything away. The cover for the Miss Marple collection, The 13 Problems, contains images primarily inspired by two of the stories, Ingots of Gold and The Blue Geranium. These stories were the first to feature Jane Marple. Her character was based in part on that of Carolyn Shepherd, who featured in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and also on Agatha's granny, of whom she said, "Always expected the worst of everyone and everything," and was, with almost frightening accuracy, usually proved right. The cover for That Came to Baghdad is based on a sketch from one of Agatha's notebooks, with the added insect and blood drops, as well as the spider's web entangling the name of one of the main characters in the book. The iconic cover of They Do It With Mirrors features a lovely mirror trick itself, with a gun sitting on sheet music for Chopin's Prelude in E-flat major, all reflected in several mirrors that cleverly cut the garden background in half. One of the victims in this novel, David Baker, is referred to as a peacock throughout the book, hence the feathery background, and the dagger cuts through the numbers 6 and 7, 67 being the number of the flat where Norma, the titular third girl of the novel, is living. The cover of Three-Act Tragedy features Bartholomew Strange's pork glass, and a rose which is related to the method of extraction of the poison in the story. The rotting fish and the twisted rope feature in an epic swim that occurs in the novel, towards zero. If you look carefully, the rope is coiled into the shape of a zero, and so the fish head is curved towards zero. The early cover of Why Didn't They Ask Evans features a still life with a golf ball that leads to the discovery of the body, a photo from the victim's pocket, and the murder weapon. The later cover keeps the golf ball and introduces the seagulls to draw more attention to the location of the mystery, which occurs in the Welsh seaside town of Marchbold. If you think your favourite design was missing from the collection, Tom was occasionally unavailable to do a cover or a redesign during his time with Fontana, and another artist, Ian Robinson, was employed to do covers in the same style, and many people get confused between two, so here's a selection of Ian's covers. Also, several of the novels were reprinted under the Bantam imprint in the early 1980s using Tom Adams' cover art. Where it didn't exist because he hadn't illustrated that particular novel, well, they simply took art from other covers without regard to how the illustrations related to the story. What a shocker! There were a few Christie mysteries that were not initially illustrated by Tom because the rights for these books weren't held by Fontana or Pocket at the time he was employed to do the covers. However, Tom was later commissioned to produce covers for Hercule Poirot and the Greenshaw Folly in 2014, as well as a matching set of The Mysterious Affair at Styles and Curtain, Poirot's Last Case in 2016. The HarperCollins box set was a special 100th anniversary edition to bring together the first Poirot novel with her last, and I think it was really fitting and lovely that they selected Tom Adams to do the covers for that special edition. And finally, I'd like to close with a fabulous little story. Apparently when Fontana started publishing books with their new design style in 1980, sales of Christie's books dropped significantly. A little bit of research later, it turned out this was because the new book designs focused much more on the gory side of the murder, whereas most Christie readers had picked up her books because they preferred the so-called cosy crime, the type of illustration that Tom Adams had done so well. Goes to show what an impact a cover can have. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something interesting. Please share in the comments if you have any special Agatha Christie reading memories or which is your favourite paperback design. Till next time, bye!